Hey guys, today I want to talk about Samson. Samson was equivalent to kind of like the Incredible Hulk today for us, but spoke clearly. When you see the originals of the Incredible Hulk, I know when I was growing up, the Incredible Hulk that we knew of was Lou Ferrigno, and he did not speak. His lesser of his ego, Bruce Banner, was the genius, was the scientist, but the Hulk did not speak. I know today, as our children, the next generation watches their version of the Hulk, he actually speaks and is intelligible, and there's a whole character that they developed where there's a smart Hulk, which is pretty cool. But Samson was the man that the Bible describes as having strength that was just supernatural. In fact, when he was being thought of in God's heart, he was to be separated as a Nazarite. God approaches his mother and speaks to her, and the Bible says, you will have a son, he tells her. This is the angel of the Lord, which is Jesus, appearing in the Old Testament. That's known as a Christophany. When we see Jesus appearing in the Old Testament, it's specifically showing that Jesus is eternal, so he has always existed. He didn't just exist when he was born to marry in the New Testament. So that's one thing. But he speaks specifically to Samson's mom and says, you're going to have a son and you're going to separate him for the purposes of completing and fulfilling the will of God. And he will be a Nazarite, which means you will never cut his hair. He is to never drink alcohol. And he is also to never be near any carcasses or death, anyone that dies. This was important because it was a covenant. It showed that God has had a specific plan for Samson, and the responsibility first fell on the parents. And so she goes and tells the father, Manoah, and Manoah is like, well, if this is going to happen, I want the angel to appear to me too. And so here comes Jesus again. He shows up. The angel of the Lord shows up to Manoah and tells him exactly what he told the mom. And fast forward, Samson is born, and immediately we see issues. In Judges chapter 13 through 16, we see his story. But there's one instance where Samson comes home and he says, hey, mom, hey, dad, I saw a Philistine woman. She's a prostitute and I want to marry her. Whoa, wait a minute. What happened to the covenant? What happened to God? What happened? And the father is like, son, we don't think this is a good idea. And he says, but that's what I want. And she's pretty. But he also was a schemer because he said, let me marry her, because if I marry her, I can get close to the enemy, which was the Philistines. And the parents kind of saw how that was plausible and allowed it and said, okay, and they celebrated. But this was not part of God's plan. And even though it was a mistake in Samson's judgment, God still blessed it because God had a covenant with Samson. But we fast forward and we see that Samson's issue with judgment was not the best. And he begins to continue to enamor these women that were not Jewish or Israelites. And that was not God's plan. And so we see a Samson that, although he was strong on the outside, he was weak on the inside. Eventually, he ends up in the hands of Delilah, who is a Philistine. She tries to convince him. He continues to kind of scheme her. And eventually he gave in. And the Philistines come, they take him, they pluck his eyes out, they imprison him. And we know that the story is sad and almost deemed as a failure. But in all of this, God redeems the story. He gives him an opportunity at the end of his life to give him his supernatural power back, because Delilah convinced him what the secret was, and it was cutting his hair. And once she cut it, he lost all that power. But in the end, he's a prisoner. He's in the temple where all these Philistines are worshiping their gods. And he says, God, give me one more time, one more chance to be able to feel your power and your strength so I can destroy all these Philistines in one place. And the Bible says that God heard his prayer, restored his strength for one last time, because not only was he able to destroy the temple with his hands and his strength, but he also died in that process. It's not how the story was supposed to go. But Samson is an example of how we as men can portray the strength from the outside, but on the inside, we're not coming to terms with the weakest parts of ourselves. So let us be reminded that Samson, even though his story was partially redeemed at the end, and we can theorize and we can have theological discussions of whether his soul was saved or not, and we don't have time to do that. It's not fair to you as a listener. But the bottom line is, God did hear his prayer. He did give him the strength, and he was able to do that last act for the glory of God. But we don't have to allow our story to be that way. Let us be mindful of our weaknesses, focus on our strengths, and have the Lord work in us and through us for the glory of his name.